thank you all for staying until the bitter end. I also, especially since I'm the last person talking, I'd like to thank the organizers. I sent Scott an email last night at 2 a.m. and he replied 1 hour later and 1 hour after that, so I'll let you do the math. So if you think you're tired, so I think that this talk connects nicely to the previous one because that was about communication and one about language. So language. But before we begin, I actually want to take a step back and tell you what I mean by language. When I say I'm talking about language, I don't mean I'm talking about specific language. I'm not talking about English or Japanese as such. I'm talking about the abstract cognitive system that produces languages. I'm talking about the part of the brain that allows us to learn a language, that allows us to take this constant barrage of sensory information and somehow chunk it into meaningful units. Yeah? So this way of thinking about language is something that's due in large part to this graduate student who's doing work on his dissertation at Harvard University in the 1950s. This handsome young gentleman, you may have heard about him. His name is Noam Chomsky. He had this idea that there's this idea of universal grammar. So the idea is, not to say that all languages have the same grammar. There's obviously big differences between English on one hand and Japanese on the other. They have different words, they have different rules. But the idea is that if you take all the languages in the world and you sort of zoom back, there are going to be a lot of similarities there. You're going to see tendencies in the way that we process language, in the ways that we learn languages. And so there'll be a lot more. Perhaps the similarities between languages will be even more striking than the differences between them. So today I'm going to be talking about one particular pair of language families, which at first blush look completely different. And that's spoken language and sign language. So in spoken language, of course, I use my mouth and tongue to communicate. You're receiving this information through your ears. Sign language, you use your hands and your face to communicate information. It's the visual system that you use to perceive it. But before I get into some of the similarities between these two systems, I just want to comment on some background stuff, because I think it's likely that not many of you have that much background in sign language. So I want to debunk some misconceptions, debunk some myths. So the first point that I want to say is that sign language is not mine. Maybe you know this already, but in case you don't, it's not just gestures. That is to say, in sign languages, you can talk about abstract things like ideas, you can talk about philosophy, mathematics. And moreover, just like in spoken language, words are arbitrary. What I mean by that is that you can't see a sentence and then know that though it's a gesture, what it means. Right? So just to prove this to you, I'm going to take a case study. So here's a word in sign language. All right, this is the interactive part, first interactive part. What do you think this means? Oh, you are in great consensus. And if you were talking to somebody in American Sign Language, you were absolutely incorrect. This means where. Though, it is true that in French Sign Language, it means not or no. But then in Israeli Sign Language, it means who. So the point is, you guessed wrong, sorry. However, this one word can be used in a bunch of different languages, just like a certain sound combination in spoken language can have different meanings in different languages. Yeah? Second point, which is sort of anticipated by my previous slide, there's actually more than one sign language. There's no international sign language. I included this picture at a conference that I attended a couple of years ago. On this slide, we have Peter Hauser, Dr. Peter Hauser on the left, presenting in American Sign Language. Concurrently, it is being interpreted into British Sign Language on the right-hand side of the stage, as 4 other interpreters are interpreting into yet 4 more sign languages across the bottom of the stage. I like this picture because it really sort of brings out the fact that these aren't mutually intelligible languages. It also relates to another myth. Oh, well, by the way, maybe you thought, well, that's obvious. Different countries will have different sign languages. Not obvious to everybody. I took this screen caption, this screenshot of the Airbnb website. It's hard to read on the slide, but it's got all these letters that says which languages do you speak. And I check English, French, and then sign language. which is sort of like if you had a box that said, I speak spoken language. Myth number 3 is that ASL is just signed English. This was also anticipated by the previous slide. In fact, sign languages have their own grammar, they have their own history. One interesting fact is that American Sign Language and British Sign Language, which are both used in countries where they use the same spoken language, are actually different languages. And for sort of somewhat arbitrary historical reasons, American Sign Language is descended from French Sign Language. And so French Sign Language and American Sign Language are closer. So it might be easier for an American signer to understand a French signer than it would to understand a British signer. Sort of like an Italian and Spanish speaking. Yeah. So sign languages are natural human languages. So what I'm going to show is that on a bunch of different fronts, they have the same grammatical pattern and the same flow. I'm going to argue that looking at these two distinct modalities, modalities mean like manner of communicating, sort of mode of language. Looking at these two different modalities will give us a richer perspective on the language system as a whole. We did this with a couple of case studies. The first one has to do with sign language phonology. That's the study of sounds. Now you may be asking yourself already, how can you have a study of sounds for sign language? And I'll try to convince you that there's something that's analogous to sign language. But first, let's talk about some phonology in English. I have here some sounds from English. You may know that there are sounds that we say when we're producing English. These correspond more or less to the letters of the alphabet, but not entirely. It's like X, that's sort of two sounds, right? But something maybe you haven't noticed is that there are these natural classes of sounds, sounds that have similar properties in the way that you make them. So, for example, consider P, B, and M. Silently say these to yourself. You'll notice that in each of these cases, your lips are the part that's coming together. Pa, ba, ma. It's always my lips. Likewise, T, D, and N. It's always my tongue hitting the top of my head. There are other kinds of natural classes, like the way that you produce it. So, for example, you can say when you're saying a P, T, or a K, you have a burst coming out, right? Pa, cha, ka. This is a burst right here. Put your mouth in front, your hand in front of your mouth. You do this right now. Go pa, cha, ka. And you'll notice that there's a burst of air that's in there too. Now, just to sort of make sure that I got you with me, I left two of these cells blank. So I have here K. So if B is the analog of P, my voice, what should I put in this cell? Anybody? G. Yeah, that's great. G. So ka, ga, it's in the same place. How about in this last one? I've got nasal things, M and N. What's the correlate with the KG? Anybody? Not an A, no? H. I'll give you a hint. It's a trick because in English we don't have a single letter for it. It's a enough. Yeah, it's an NG sound. The NG sound. And so I don't like using two letters, so I'm going to change that into a single letter. It's like an N with a G coming down. We'll call it an A. You'll see that later. So what I want to say though is, we take this analog thing, which is acoustics, and we have this tendency in language to divide it up into discrete chunks of specific things that we organize along different dimensions. And it turns out that sign language is just the same. Instead of having place of articulation and manner of articulation in the mouth, you have other parameters that you divide sides along in space. So these are things like handshake, what your hand is doing. Things like location, where you're signing on your body. Movement, what's the movement? If it's going up or down or sideways or jiggling. And orientation, which way your hand is facing. So just as we saw P, B, and M as being all at the same, having the same place of articulation, but different manners of articulation, here are father, mother, and fine. I don't know if you can see them. They're pronounced like this: father, mother, and fine. Same handshake, same motion, same orientation, with different locations. So we see the same sort of thing. It's like a drained space, but it's divided up into segments, into discrete units. change from one form to another. This is called, these are like phonological processes. You see that sound will change. And it turns out that these phonological processes target specific natural classes, the ways, the dimensions that I just described. One case study in English is assimilation. So take the prefix in, as in interminable. This TED conference is interminable. I want you to notice that this N of in changes if you put it in front of a word that begins with a P or a B, like possible. It's not impossible, it's impossible. Yeah. Or how about inconceivable? I'll say it slowly, inconceivable. You'll notice that I actually don't, usually, at least in running speech, I don't say an N sound, I say that N sound that I said before. They don't have a letter for it, otherwise I might actually write it that way. But inconceivable. What's going on here? Well, T's, P's, and K sounds have something in common with the N's, M's, and N sounds. Yeah? It's a place of articulation. So what you see is a process where one segment is becoming similar to another segment along some dimension. I've just sort of tried to illustrate this in a more schematized way. You have, when you put an N together with a K, that's something that's pronounced with the tip of your tongue and the back of your tongue. That turns into something that's produced with the back of the tongue, back of the tongue. Generalization, the N of in changes place to match the following concept. So what about sign language? I'm going to be talking about assimilation in sign language, focusing on handshake. This alphabet and numbers. So here's an example. Tomato. Does anybody have any background in American Sign Language here? No, this will be, okay, good. That means everything I can tell could be a lie. The sign for tomato is sound like this. No? This comes from two words, red and chop. And it's a compound in the same way you take in and conceivable, put them together. But what you see is the handshake for red is one index finger. Handshake for chop is a palm like this. But when you put them together, it's tomato. All of a sudden, you take the handshake from the first part and you spread the second part. So tomato. This is assimilation of the handshake. Here's another example. Think is this sign. Self is that sign. If I were to say think for yourself, it's sort of one word in one unit in American Sign Language. It comes from think for yourself. But what you see is that the index finger from think is assimilated on, sorry, I said that backwards. The thumb from self is assimilated onto the handshake for think. So you actually sign this in running sign as like this. You start with the L handshake and self. So a new handshake is produced, this L handshake, just in the way that when you put N and K together, we got a new sound that wasn't in either of the two English words. I have one more example. So I started out by saying, here's the patterns and sounds of language. You know, I said, how would you even possibly conceive of something like that in sign language? And it turns out, though, that there's almost a direct correlate. We have these meaningless perceptual units that we like to put in chunks along a continuum that are arranged in dimensions that give you natural classes of sounds or of signs, and these natural classes are exactly what are targeted by these processes. It's pretty cool. Sign language phonology. Let's go again. All right. So here's what's going to happen. I'm going to give you two signs, and I'll give you two English translations, and you have to guess which sign is associated with which translation. This is a very easy matching test. There will be two of each. Right. So I'll put this up on the board. So here's the first sign. First sign is this. Second sign is this. Two words, One of these means decide, one of these means ponder. Alright, now just think for yourself. Which one do you think is which? Alright, we're going to have a vote. Who thinks? Yeah, alright, no discussion. So first, if anybody already knows the answer to this, please don't participate. Ignore it for the class. Who here, by a show of hands, thinks that this means decide? Who thinks that this means ponder? This is an overwhelming, I heard a little bit of discussion, so maybe this went through the crowd, but you overwhelmingly just decided one way. And well, I have a confession to make. I lied about these two translations. This sign means play, and this sign means arrive. Neither of them mean ponder, which is kind of like this, or decide, which is kind of like this. So this is sort of, okay, first point, you say, well, yeah, of course, Jeremy, you showed us in slide 3 that, of course, there's an arbitrary sign meaning corresponding, so of course you can't guess, that's not very fair. That was actually not slide 3. Slide 3 is the way that Chomsky knows. But no, there's something here, which is that you all, uniformly decided that one of these meant one of these two things. And as far as I can tell, there's nothing, inherently, obvious about this meaning pondering, which is what you, if I came up to you out of blue and said, what does this mean? You wouldn't say ponder, right? It might just be a fluke. But I'm going to actually tell you that it's not a fluke. And that there's this interesting thing in common between play and ponder on one hand, and arrive and decide on the other. And it's something really not quite straightforward, because both play and arrive have to do with what you're doing with your body, whereas ponder and decide are things that have to do with your mind. But it turns out there is something in common. It's an abstract semantic property, that is an abstract property of meaning that relates to the time course of these events. This is called telicity. I'll explain what this means. It turns out that this idea of telicity is something that goes back to this handsome fellow, Aristotle. The idea is that if you're pondering something versus deciding something, both of those events have something very similar. You're just sort of going through a mental process. But the critical difference is that when you decide something, there's an end state that emerges. You reach a new state, the state of decision. Just likewise, if you play, you're doing an activity for an extended period of time. But with arriving, you do an activity and going somewhere, and then finally you get there. So there's the state of being there that emerges. This extra thing that emerges. There's a point of culmination of these events. So we have words for this. The kinds that have a point of culmination called telic events. The kind that don't have a point of culmination called atelic events. And it turns out that in language, including languages such as diverse and strange as English, natural language makes reference to these two different kinds of events. So I want to point out these temporal adverbials, in an hour versus for an hour. Telic events systematically like using in an hour. So eat an apple, if you eat an apple, there's a point of culmination, no more apple. And you say, John ate an apple in an hour. Paint a picture, at the end, you have a picture that's there. You say, John painted a picture in an hour. If you come to a decision, you decide that you come to a decision. You say, John came to a decision in 30 minutes. With that decision that appears. John arrived at the party in a split second. You say, in. You don't say, John arrived at the party for 30 minutes. Something very weird about that. Whereas atelic events, this abstract semantic idea that I discussed, is systematically coded for adverbials. So if I say, John, so if you sleep, there's no point of culmination, there's just an activity you do. You say, John slept for 30 seconds, or 30 minutes, not 30 seconds. Yeah. It would be sort of weird to say, John slept in 30 seconds. Maybe he fell asleep, but then you have a state of sleep. So this research by a researcher named Ronald Wilbur and some of her collaborators in which he makes this interesting observation that in fact across sign languages, not just American Sign Language, but other sign languages, including, for example, Croatian Sign Language, you actually systematically distinguish telicity in the phonological form of the sign, in the form of the sign itself. So telic verbs systematically stop sharply. So I arrive, this is point of contact. I decide, it stops sharply. Atelic verbs, on the other hand, have this continuous motion. I play, and it keeps on going. I mold something over, I ponder something, it's a continual motion. This is sort of surprising, right? If I told you at the beginning, sign language signs correspond in their form with their meaning, you might say, oh, okay, do you mean that this means chicken? Well, maybe, I don't know. But you probably wouldn't have said, I think there's something about the abstract temporal duration of an event that is encoded iconically in the form of a sign. That would probably not be your first guess. But in fact, this is more than just signs. It really seems like there's this genuine impulse in the way that we process language to have this contrast. So there's research by Brent Strickland and his colleagues just published this year that shows basically he did exactly the same experiment that I did with you guys, where he had naive non-signers look at a sign and try and guess the meaning of two things. And he showed that with a wide range of verbs, which were either telic or atelic, you had this property where people always match the atelic sign with the atelic meaning, even if they weren't actual corresponding meanings. So this is this really surprisingly robust connection between what essentially is the visual system, the way we perceive the world, the way that we perceive motions, and this abstract conceptual space, the way that we categorize events. The same way that we categorize events with things like the word for or the word in. It's sort of bizarre. I think it's really surprising. So this is essentially where I want to leave us, but since the theme for today is the tipping point, I figured I should at least have a picture of a guy on a tightrope. Amy Chen earlier mentioned this idea that the tipping point is maybe more you always think about it as falling off of something. And then since she adopted this idea of maybe it's that point of balance. And so maybe my whole talk has been a lead up to my take on the tipping point, which is the tipping point really is this point of balance where you're balancing between two things. You're balancing perhaps between 2 points in your life, or if you're a scientist, you're balancing between 2 different phenomena, 2 very different things, maybe spoken language and sign language. So the idea that I want to conclude with inspirationally is that maybe if you find that point of balance, when you have a point of view of both sides, that's a place where you can really get the best idea of what the world's like. Thank you.